Good morning. So, about 2 weeks ago, Jody and I were at the Circle of Hope dinner, which is a fundraiser for Fairbanks Hospital, which is, if you're not familiar with Fairbanks, it's a recovery hospital here in Indianapolis that treats alcoholics and drug addicts. It's the largest facility of its type in this part of the country, and every year they have a fundraiser. Jody and I have attended for 4 or 5 years now, and they always have a keynote speaker, and typically that speaker is somebody who has dealt with the tragedy of drug addiction in their life, and then it's usually a comeback story, you know, that they were able to recover from that addiction, and it's typically a fairly prominent person. I didn't know the name of the guy that was talking when we went. It was a fellow by the name of Austin Eubanks, and it was interesting. He told his story about drug addiction. The one thing that made his story a little bit different from some of the other keynote addresses that I had seen was that the first time that Austin had had a brain-altering substance in his body was when he was on a gurney in an ambulance. Outside of Columbine High School. You know, when I work on these things at home, I don't get all in. Anyway, he was in an ambulance. He'd been shot twice, and once in the hand and once in the knee. And it was the first time he had ever had a mind-altering substance in his body. What he realized very quickly was that the same drugs that they were giving him to relieve him of his physical pain did a great job of taking away his emotional pain too. And he continued using that form of medication for the next 11 years. When he finally ran out of doctors who were willing to prescribe him medication, he changed to alcohol and street drugs to treat his pain. And the end result of that is he woke up in a jail cell in downtown Denver, not knowing how he got there. And that was when he made the change in his life. Once he got out of jail, he put himself into treatment. He was in a residential treatment program for over a year. And then he came out, joined a 12-step program, got his life back together. And today he's a sought-after speaker. He travels around the country speaking to groups that are dealing with issues of how to deal with trauma productively. He speaks to groups about drug addiction, his experience with addiction and recovery. And he talks about how this all happened as a result of this great tragedy in his life, but that today he is actually able to look back at that time and with a sense of gratitude. Because before Columbine, he was just a normal, everyday kid who cared mostly about fishing and playing golf. And today he had a life purpose, and he was helping to change the world. That got me thinking. I got curious to know about what had happened to the other folks from Columbine. And you find out there's a number of people that followed the same path, unfortunately, that Austin did. There were a lot of people that you keep in mind that the shooting just didn't affect the kids who were in the room that day or the parents of the kids who had been killed or injured. It hurt a whole community. There are 5 teachers at Columbine High School today that were there the day of the shooting as students. So there are good stories and there's tragic stories. The story that really got me, Jody actually, I was kind of struggling with how I was going to pull all this together into a talk today. And Jody happened to be getting ready for work and saw this video that I've been sharing with you this morning on the Today Show, and she said, "I think your story is in there." And that's where I first learned about Rachel Scott and her brother Craig. And I won't go through the details of what happened with Craig and Rachel. You pretty much know that now from watching the movie. But a couple of things that are interesting. You know, Rachel was, like a lot of 17-year-old girls, enamored with the story of Anne Frank. And because of that, she kept a lot of diaries. And her parents, of course, never read those diaries until after she died. And when the family started going through her diaries, they found a lot of drawings. Those are some of the drawings that I've had up during the songs today. And a lot of things she had written that were extremely poignant and seemed way beyond a kid of 16 or 17 years old. And as they were in her room trying to look around and find things, they They ended up, for some reason, that they don't ever really explain. You can put that slide back up, Nate. On the back of a dresser, they found this, which is she had traced her hands. And I think you can read it, but it basically says someday she's going to touch millions of hearts. The family took that as a sign that they needed to put their grief aside and do something to carry on Rachel's legacy. They founded an organization called Rachel's Challenge, and that organization speaks to kids in schools about these things. Basically, how to believe in themselves and how to help the world be a better place. And I saw an interview with Rachel's father a couple days ago, and it was one of those 20 years after Columbine things that were going around last week. And he noted that their organization is now smoking to over 11 million kids. You know, I'm certain that when Rachel wrote those words, she didn't expect that it was going to happen this way. But it is an amazing thing what God can do if we let God into our lives, even in the darkest corners of our life. My story, and I always end up sharing more information with you folks than I probably should, but I'm going to. Again, my story is, I don't know the level of horror that these parents felt. I don't know the great anguish that I'm sure they felt. I do know one thing differently. I know that before Columbine, parents didn't wake up in the morning worried about what was going to happen with kids at school. We live in a post-Columbine world where our kids have grown up doing things like active shooter drills, and we no longer see that the two safest places in the world for kids are home and school. School is not one of the safest places anymore. But there are people that are trying to make it better. So I don't know the level of pain that these people have gone through, but I do know pain. And I do understand darkness. And I also understand what it means to experience God's grace. I am a person in long-term recovery. Jody is too. She said it would be okay if I shared that with you today. We've both been in recovery for a long time. Jody's actually made a career out of recovery. I don't know if you know, but she's the deputy director of the Indiana Addictions Issues Coalition, and her organization works with our government, state government, and private organizations to align resources for people in recovery. And Jody and her team are doing some incredible work to help be on the front lines of the opioid epidemic in our state. And I'm really proud of her and the people she's working with. They're doing great things. I try to help too. In my case, it's more of an avocation. I work with other people in recovery on a pretty regular basis. I'm also the president of an organization. I'm the president of the board of directors for an organization called the Suburban North Club, which is a nonprofit organization. We provide meeting space and socializing space for people in recovery, so people have a safe place to meet for 12-step groups or other forms of socialization with other people in recovery. And it's been really gratifying to be a part of that for the last couple of years. When you're in the recovery community, as we are, you see a lot of tragedy. We've honestly lost some friends, people we cared about that couldn't make it and ended up making the ultimate sacrifice. But we also get to experience the opportunity to see people climb out of the darkness. We've seen people put their lives back together, and today those people are helping others to do the same thing, and that's an amazing thing to see. So the question comes up is, how do we survive these tragic moments in our lives? How can we get from the darkness that we find ourselves in and move to a place of light? You know, I believe that God's grace is always there for us, that it's there waiting for us to partake in it. We just have to access it. And I found that for me, one of the greatest actions I can take to put me in a position to be able to accept God's grace is to do all I can to practice gratitude. Gratitude in every situation. See, because I believe there's two types of grace. I believe there's saving grace. That's the grace that comes in those dark moments and literally pulls us up. God's saving grace that pulls us up out of the hole that we live in. And then there's a second type of grace. There's amazing grace. That's the grace people write songs about. And that comes from being able to truly be pushed into another dimension. And that can only come when we can come to terms with our pain and be able to accept God's grace and actually find a way of having gratitude for the very things that bring our pain. In recovery, we call this surrendering. To be really free, we have to surrender. We got to find gratitude sometimes for some of these things that put us in our darkest place. And that can be a hard thing to do. But those who have survived great tragedy have all found a way to do it. It's the only way that you can go on. It's the only way you can carry yourself from there. So many years ago, our marriage was in some trouble. There was a lot of pain and a lot of blame. And at the height of this pain, at the moment where everything was falling apart, we had saving grace come into our life in the form of a ruptured appendix for our oldest son. Jody and I found ourselves, Ben was taken into emergency surgery, and Jody and I found ourselves at 2 in the morning alone in a hospital waiting room, scared to death, full of anxiety. And in that moment, we needed each other so badly. And we forgave each other. I believe that was the moment that saved our family. The next day, Jody began her recovery journey. And Ben was home a couple of days later, and I was driving around, and Jody was home with Ben, and I was driving the car, and I don't go anywhere without music. The music's always playing. And I had it on my shuffle, on my revolving playlist, and this old song came on the radio, From the Dark End of the Street to the Bright Side of the Road. This is why I don't sing with the band. We'll be lovers once again on the bright side of the road. I listened to that song, and those thoughts came through my head, and I couldn't stop thinking about Jody and where we had been and where I was hoping we were headed. I stopped at CVS, and I went in and I bought one of those pretty greeting cards that doesn't have any words in it, and I wrote down the lyrics of the song. And at the bottom, I told her I loved her and that we were going to get there. Over the next several years, Jody actively recovered. She surrendered, and through her experience, she learned to accept her past and ultimately learned gratitude for her story, the high points, the low points, and everything in between. And that's when she found herself rocketed into this other dimension. She found serenity and peace and courage and wisdom. And just like Austin, the drug addict from Columbine, and Craig, who lost his brother and his two best friends, she found that her experience, if shared with others, could change the world, could start a chain reaction. Now, I wish I'd gone the same way Jody did, but the truth is I didn't. I had to dig a little deeper. And I continued on my path for another 5.5 years. Finally, I found myself in a new bottom. And in that time, in the trauma of that moment, I finally accepted who I was. And I surrendered. A couple of days after I went into recovery, Jody came to me with a greeting card. It was the same one I had given her before, and she had just simply written her name at the bottom of the page. And I remember those lyrics, "From the dark end of the street to the bright side of the road." My own experience in recovery was similar to Jody's. I found a connection to a higher power that has brought me peace with who I am. I've learned to not only accept my past, but to have gratitude for every part of it. And I've experienced amazing grace. I take pleasure with sharing my experiences with other people, anybody really who will listen. Jody and I both get an opportunity to speak frequently, to share our stories with other people in recovery. But not long ago, we got an unusual opportunity. It was a last-minute thing. Somebody called up and asked Jody if she would give a talk. And she said, okay. And then she walked into my office and said, hey, we're going to give a talk together tonight. And I thought, okay, do they do it that way? And she was like, well, no, I don't know that anybody ever has, but we're going to give it a try. And so I agreed, and we headed out to go give this talk. And as we were driving over, I was nervous. Jody was nervous. We didn't know how this was going to go. We had no time to prepare for it. We really didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how we'd be received. We didn't know if we were going to help anybody by the time we were done. We just really didn't know. And of course, I had the music playing on shuffle again like I always do. And as we were driving down the street and the church came into view where we were going to be speaking that night, an old song came on. You know, Jody kind of giggled. I cried a little. And then we got out of the car and went into the church and started our own chain reaction. It's my prayer today for all of us that we can open our hearts to each other. And for those of us that are in pain today, we'll open our hearts to God and the grace that He has for us. And we'll let God take our deepest sorrows and weave them into a pattern for good. Amen.